Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Doomer Optimist podcast. My name is Tara Thieke, and I'm here with my co-host today, Donald, and we are filling in for the normal Doomer Optimist hosts. And we're here today with David Cayley, who some of you may know as the author of a recent biography on Ivan Illich. Before we get started today, Ivan Illich had a habit, or so I am told from his writings, of lighting a candle in memory of the stranger who comes to the door unforeseen. And so I was going to light a little candle and hope that we could sort of start our discussion today in honor of his life and his spirit, and in honor of all the people who we don't know are listening, but maybe here and walking with us down this road to come. And from there, Donald, I think you wanted to start with a poem and maybe tell us who wrote it as well.
Yeah, Wendell Berry has written many Sabbath poems, and in 2012 he wrote a Sabbath poem in memory of Ivan Illich, the title of which is just the Roman numeral for 10, and he wrote this poem in 2012. The creek flows full over the rocks after lightning, thunder, and heavy rain. Its constant old song rises under the still unblemished green, new leaves of old sycamores that have so far withstood the hardest flows. And this is the flux, the thrust, the slow song of the great making, the world never at rest, still being made of the ever less and less that we, for the time being, make of it.
Great. Thank you. So David, would you be able to introduce yourself to our audience today and maybe start with a few words about Ivan Illich for some of the people in the Doomer Optimist audience who aren't too familiar with him but would like to learn more?
Well, yes, I'm a man of advanced years, as you can see, living in Toronto. I was a lifelong broadcaster. I discovered that I could make a living at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation doing things I was interested in doing when I was quite young. So I worked at the CBC in radio for most of my adult life until I retired in 2012. I met Ivan Illich first in 1969, was very attracted to his writings, invited him to Toronto in 1970 when he was, I would say, at the height of his celebrity, which was then worldwide, to a teach-in we had organized. Was always thereafter a keen reader, but got connected to him again in the later 80s when he agreed to allow me to come and visit him in State College, Pennsylvania, where he was then teaching at Penn State. And though that became a 5-hour series of broadcasts for the CBC, led to a book called Ivan Illich in Conversation, and an adventure that then continued for the rest of his life. He died in 2002. In which I became a kind of amanuensis, I guess you would say, or secretary. And after a lot of asking, he shared with me towards the end of the 90s his thoughts on the way in which the Roman Catholic Church shaped Western society. And that became a second book called The Rivers North of the Future, published after he died. So when I left the CBC in 2012, I knew my task would be to come to grips with all that he had given me and to see if I could pass it on, draw out its implications. So that became the book you mentioned. It was originally called A Candle in the Dark, apropos your candle, a name which the Penn State Press considered to be a little too New Age, perhaps. I don't know how they thought of it, but they didn't like it, which was unfortunate because I think it reflected the man, but maybe they thought it sounded too much like an Elton John song or something. So it became Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey, was published in the winter, a year ago, more or less, a month more. So here we are.
That's wonderful. I like your original title, but
yeah, so did I. But publishers are publishers, and they contractually have the say on titles.
Unfortunately.
David, in the introduction to the book, you talk about all the reasons that it's not a normal biography, and that Illich was very reticent about the idea of a biography of him. I'm curious if you could get into that a little bit.
Yes, he explained
the idea
to
of
me,
chastity.
Well, he explained to me one afternoon in a long conversation that it would be impossible to write a biography of him. I think he didn't mean that someone couldn't attempt it, although he did as good a job as he could at covering his traces. And if there is much of a paper trail, I don't know where it is. But more than that, he claimed that it was impossible for anyone to oversee, let's say, to view synoptically another person, because all that person's relations were shaded, was the word he used, from anyone else's view. They were known only to the two. So, in effect, he said that although what my life means may be known to me at the moment of my death, it's not known in any other way and at any other time. So he felt that biography of a certain kind, biography that pretended to that synoptic view, as I called it was an impertinence. And since he was my dear friend, I would never have attempted such a thing. And yet, on the other hand, his life was part of what he did. So I felt it was in certain ways open to discussion. His thought was open to discussion. And so that was how I tried to engage with him. But I wanted to make clear at the beginning that I had no aspiration to write a biography. And obviously it's going to be called an intellectual biography for convenience. I mean, you can't stop people from calling people things, right? So, I mean, John Holt used to say that apropos homeschooling, with which he was an enterprise with which he was lumbered as one of the originators, that he absolutely did not want to be seen as engaging in homeschooling. But that once people called it that, what are you going to do?
Mm-hmm.
That's what it's called conventionally, so you call it. So it's an intellectual biography, but it's not a biography.
David, when we were sort of asking members of the Doomer Optimist universe what they wanted to learn about Illich, he's sort of been having a bit of a resurgence in different corners. I don't know if you've experienced this, but his name comes up more frequently than I would say it did a few years ago. And there's something so attractive about, I would say hopeful, that even though he's making this incredibly deep critique of modern society and the institutions, he also sort of gives hope to people who are maybe feel that the task before us is incredibly imposing, because he's not asking us to go back and overtake the institutions and come up with rival institutions. But I would say he's just asking us to see the world with a spirit of conviviality and friendship, and to hold on to that even when things seem hopeless. And I was wondering if maybe you could sort of expand on conviviality and the Illichian vision in this time when people are coming up against institutions that seem to have more and more authority over our lives.
Well, he concluded a book called Deschooling Society, which was published in 1971 with an essay, which I would unreservedly recommend to everyone, called The Rise of Epimethean Man. A kind of obscure title, but Epimetheus and Prometheus in Greek mythology were brothers. They mean literally the forethinker and the afterthinker, Prometheus being the forethinker. So he says in that essay that he regards the recovery of hope as a, I don't know how exactly he says it, as a primary task, right? That Prometheanism, as he describes it, is the attempt to control, to plan, to project the future. Hope is the expectation of being surprised. That's paradoxical. Hope is the hope of being surprised. It is the disposition, that's better, to be surprised, to not know where salvation might come from, or to put it more simply, where a new friend might come from. So hope is the primary note in his whole work, in his whole opus, and in his life as a Christian. Conviviality was a phrase that was a term he kind of invented, I think, in the sense that he remembered the publisher at telling him that, conventionally conviviality meant a kind of tipsy jollity, right? That it wasn't really what he wanted to say. And he liked having slightly off-center terms, or he hoped they would open eyes, and certainly they weren't easily co-opted. Paradoxical counterproductivity isn't apt to become anybody's slogan. And happily, so far, conviviality hasn't really become anybody's slogan. But he meant what is within everyone's reach, right? Which is to cut back, to renounce, to put sociability and the disposition to be surprised first. So one could go at great lengths into that book, which is a wonderful and rich book, but it does begin with what he calls joyful, quoting Aquinas, joyful austerity, or discovering what we can do without, right? So it is, again, that's something that's within everybody's reach. As he says in Deschooling Society, that each of us is responsible for our own deschooling. Mm-hmm. That was a very unpopular sentence with Marxists. Because it shows him to be a voluntarist, right?
Yes.
He thinks we can, that individuals can act rather than having to change the system first. He's never very interested in systems.
In the conclusion to your book, you talk about complementarity as the central idea for you from Illich. And Tara and I were part of a reading group on his book Gender, which I feel like we just barely scratched the surface of. such a rich book, but and I think that the term complementarity gets thought about in relation to gender, but the way you discuss it and the way he uses it is a lot broader than that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about his idea of complementarity.
Well, yes, it was a discovery for me. I mean, I can remember 20 or 30 even years ago joking with somebody that my philosophy of life was you can't win. And it doesn't sound initially like much of a philosophy, but I think I've always had this idea of the balance of opposites, that to win is to lose is to win. And so as I looked into his work and began to think about it, it is obvious in gender, where the theme of complementarity is explicitly sounded, but it's there throughout his work, right? That it's about balance. Tools for Conviviality is all about balances. And so when he, for example, in the Essays in Shadow Work, writes about the vernacular, he's writing about a complementary sphere, which he thinks has been almost extinguished by professional hegemonies. He doesn't say there should be no professions. He says that unless they're balanced by a sphere in which people do for themselves, think for themselves, speak for themselves, discover the world for themselves, the professional hegemony becomes to that extent pernicious. It becomes a form of domination. So again, you see there's the image of balance. In gender, I mean, it's everywhere. It's explicit only in one footnote where he says that the social sciences should have been based, could have been based on an idea of complementarity, but instead it succumbed to a set of master categories which felt they could construe the world as one field. And he singles out Niels Bohr's idea of complementarity as a road not taken outside of physics. I think that's true. But if you read the book carefully, as evidently you both have done, you see that he sees this extends all the way to the throne of God, so to speak, right? That without the capacity to grasp the otherness of one another, we're powerless to grasp the otherness of God. So his essay is written on so many different levels. It's no wonder, and so quickly and in such a condensed fashion, it's no wonder the book generated confusion and opposition. But he certainly, and so as I read more into him, I began to see the idea everywhere, right? And of course, it applies fundamentally within Christianity itself, as he related to me in the conversations that became The Rivers North of the Future. That by not seeing the shadow, the opposing domain evoked by the appearance of the Christ, the church made itself, in effect, the domain of the shadow. And so, yes, I think the idea is everywhere in his work.
I had two experiences recently that made this part of Illich make a lot more sense to me. One was reading your book, and the other, especially at the end, how you talk about his desire for keeping things separate, for protecting spheres of life from the market or politics. And then I led a seminar recently where we read women writing against suffrage in the early 20th century. And very fascinating writings that have been lost to history. No one reads this stuff anymore. But it was so, I mean, Illichian. This is before Illich's time, but these women were identifying that they were trying to protect a sphere of life from the encroachment of politics. And they were understood that that was what was at stake. And it was fascinating to see that idea of complementarity as an open question, versus now it seems like everything has been sort of colonized by politics and the market, that it's hard to find many places that one can defend or set aside. So anyway, thank you for your book. I think is very valuable. Illich, I feel like reading him, he's almost creating like the scaffolding for future research and thinking with a lot of his books. That he just teases us or gives us the beginning of an idea with the expectation that someone later on will pick it up. And engender with his footnotes, he seems to do that.
Oh yeah.
So thank you so much for filling in some of the gaps.
Well, and or at least passing them on. So I mean, he was quite explicit about that when we did the conversations that became the Rivers North of the Future, that this was, he said, a research hypothesis, and hints for others to pick up and follow. Yeah, there's so much more to think about, and I think there's always an implicit invitation in Illich to return to the source, to begin again.
So, David, could you tell us a little bit more about what I think returning to the source means? I was watching part of the interviews he did that were called Part Moon, Part Traveling Salesman, and there was an interesting moment where someone summed him up as saying that he wasn't interested in just Catholic just economics, like a Catholic version of distributism or something like that, but that he questioned the economic dominance interpretation of society. And that seems so radical. I loved hearing that, but I know that to many people, it's a huge ask right now to not see life and everything through the lens of politics and economics. So could you sort of flesh out that source we could return to without that political and economic frame? Is it the liturgy? Is it our work, our families?
Well, I'm sure it's all of those things, but I think for him, it's a way of understanding or receiving the incarnation. What does it mean, right? So he begins in the Rivers North of the Future, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I hadn't asked a question. He said, for me, the gospel represents the freedom to love, and to love one another as embodied beings, and to find God in our love for one another. So he's talking about something that's available, that's always available, and to that extent is abundant. So it's opposite to the primary axiom of economics, which is scarcity. And he's talking about something that exists in awareness. So his first collection of writings that was published was called Celebration of Awareness. And I think the term is pretty significant. It's a pretty deliberately chosen title. You can't overcome economics to the extent that it's established all around us. You can't, and I think the last thing he'd want would be people who lived anxiously about, constantly aware of their falling short of the doctrine or teaching that they should have followed. But you can have awareness. You can see, right? His wonderful short. He said once that he didn't think he'd really understood a gospel story until he could see the humor in it. And he compares understanding the gospel to getting a joke, which is kind of interesting. To hear the joke, he says, one gets it, right? Those who have ears to hear, let them hear. It's a question. It's a question of awareness, of letting yourself see something, of letting yourself hear something, of taking just one step, not taking 100 steps. So yeah, to return to the source at a more ambitious level evidently means to rethink what Christianity, and the very word Christianity names the problem, might have been had it not been what it became or what it was, right? So he was to pick up Donald's theme of separation. He was very, very scrupulous about separating while he acted as a priest, separating his priesthood from any political office that he might be called on to exercise. So when he was sent to the University of Puerto Rico at Ponce and became vice rector there, and sometimes quite often acting rector, he wouldn't celebrate Mass, except he bought a little hut in a little fishing community where no one knew who he was, and he would go there and say Mass with the fishermen. So he wanted a very strict separation of the otherworldly office of the priest from any political function that he would exercise. And that made him, although he convened the meetings at which what became liberation theology got going, he always kept his distance from it insofar as he thought it was a politicization of the gospel, that the key task for him was always to disentangle the good news from any worldly entanglement. He didn't claim that the church could be other than a worldly institution, or that any institution could be other than a worldly institution, but he did claim that you could know the difference, and knowing the difference is everything. So he, in a conversation with a New Yorker writer, Francine Duplessis Gray, for a profile that was in the New Yorker in 1970, he distinguished the church as she, which is how he called it, from the church as it. So the sociological object entangled in every way in the world, from the pearl in the net, the divine bud that will flower in eternity. He had various phrases, but always pointing to something that can't be contained, that can't be finished, but that can be celebrated. But that celebration of awareness, that can be kept in mind, awareness. So that, I think, was always his way. And in various ways, as he lived, he brought that spirit of celebration into the communities he took part in, and then in part he created. So it was always there. The spirit of celebration was always there. And if I can go on with this, because I think the point is important now, when I came to discuss Apocalypse, which is one of the last chapters of the book, I had to try and say paradoxically that Illich is an apocalyptic thinker, because I think every Christian must be an apocalyptic thinker to the extent that the word has been disclosed and in effect set loose in the world. It's quite plain in Jesus' teaching that he thinks this is proceeding to a conclusion. This must proceed to a conclusion. But that Illich, on the contrary, is absolutely not an apocalyptic thinker in the usual meaning of the word, that conclusion is some sort of final violence or divine vengeance or big fireworks display, rapture. That it's for us here now to celebrate. The end of time is now here with us, and that we can live in that sense, as he says, at the edge of time. So again, it comes back to this knowing the difference, and that's why I really like what Donald said about the art of separation, right? Of telling things apart. I mean, he was finally an intellectual. He wasn't. That was the path that he was destined to, I think, partly by his superb intellect. So it is about making distinctions, but knowing what's what.
And his intellectual path took him all over the world. And the Doomer optimist crowd, I think, generally very interested in agrarian questions, ecological questions, the idea of recovering a sense of place. We opened with a Wendell Berry poem, very interested in the sense of place. And Ivan Illich certainly talks about ecology, wrote books about it, but to some degree, he seemed as a person not placeless. He's associated with a couple places very intimately in Mexico and Puerto Rico, but he traveled and lived all over, and seemed to be more temporally rooted in the 12th century. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about his connection to the idea of place, and if he had ideas about that and about recovering that.
Well, since Doomer is in the name of the aegis under which we're operating, it was his doom, let's say, to be placeless. He felt that keenly and early on when his, first of all, his mother was Jewish, although a Christian, and his father was a man from Dalmatia, in what was then Yugoslavia, split on the Dalmatian coast. The marriage seemingly foundered on the shoals of anti-Semitism, although his mother never really told the story. His father died in 1940. But whatever the reason, he ended up in Vienna at his grandfather's fairly opulent Art Nouveau mansion, where he grew up. But but being half Jewish, he was eventually displaced from Vienna to Italy. So he felt that he had been pulled up by his roots, mm-hmm. As a matter of his destiny, of what had happened to him, that he was in that sense not fated to be of a place in the way that Wendell Berry, let's say, has tried to be very much of his place. And so, yeah, he was in that sense free. I think that was part of his, what he tried to live, that he had been displaced. And I think that probably enabled him partly to find the home that he did in the 12th century, but also then to give an example of a relationship to the past. I mean, our faiths are often paradoxical in that way, right? That the one who is uprooted is the one who points you to roots. So yes, he certainly, for me, gave an example of how to find yourself, to find orientation in the past, and even to take the past seriously in our time is an immense, and I would argue necessary, achievement. So it's a very important part of who he was, to suggest that you could actually find orientation in the past. You could find a world from which to see our world, because if you can't be outside of something, you can't ever really know what it is. If you can't, I mean, you can know it from the inside, but to know it from the outside is to at least imaginatively inhabit another time, another place. So, although, and this is right. If you go right back to his reading of the New Testament, of the parable of the Samaritan, which is for him a paradigm of the whole New Testament, it shows at once the glory, the opportunity, and the danger, right? So that the one who is called to minister to love, to care for the one in the ditch is the enemy, the man from the estranged northern kingdom, the Samaritan. So the last one you would expect is the one who steps in, but in stepping in, he also steps out of his accustomed world, and to that extent, he threatens his accustomed world, which has been based on we'll look after our own, right? And obviously, Christianity is a history of bringing the other in, Ivan, it says at some point, but bringing the other in often violently, inconsiderately, recklessly. So, you know, in his time, it was the Development Crusade. Earlier, it was an actual crusade. But so, do you see what I'm trying to say? That he sees the freedom and seizes the freedom, which is evident in how he lived. He was all over the world, right? He was a jet setter who preached place. You can't get away from contradiction. You can't get away from paradox. We're back to balance. We're back to holding the opposites together. And we're back to the individual path. He was called to something. Others are called to something else, right? He through the path he chose, he became something, and he tried to live that for 10 years. He became a kind of jet age St. Paul. It wouldn't necessarily be what he had chosen. It was what he was given that he tried to live. And happily, there was a long period towards the end of his life when he didn't have to live like that.
You talk about taking the past seriously. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about his friendship across time with Hugh of St. Victor. And I'm also curious if there were any saints to which he had a particular personal devotion, if he ever talked about that with you.
Well, let me take the second part first, because his friend Lee Hoynatsky told me this, and I never heard it from Ivan. Lee and Ivan were very close friends, and Lee was with him through much of his life. And to put it in a kind of funny way, I think he was a kind of Sancho Panza to Ivan's Don Quixote at times. And Lee said that he venerated a saint who lived under the porch or the stairs of a great house to which he would have been entitled. I can't remember the name of this saint, but he was unrecognized. He lived in rags on the. Yeah, I can't tell the story properly, but it certainly involved an unrecognized figure who accepted that. So now the first part of your question I've lost because
I'm curious about his friendship across time with Hugh of St.
Yeah,
Victor.
with Hugh. So Hugh of St. Victor was the abbot, a man from Flanders who ended up in Paris, who was the abbot of a monastery, excuse me, on the left bank. Today it would be downtown Paris, but it was then on the outskirts of the old city. An order of a new order of monks who saw themselves as teachers to the emerging city. He loved Hugh of St. Victor and saw in him a man living exactly on a cusp in time, which is, I think, perhaps where he thinks we all ideally ought to live. But this was plausibly a very real cusp historically, the beginning of the 12th century Reformation, which in many ways is the beginning of modernity as Ivan understood it. So Hugh was a man with a foot in two worlds. And in his book on reading, In the Vineyard of the Text, which examines how Hugh read, he sees him as a man who still has the old style of monastic or monkish reading, in which the words are actually savored and tasted there as fruit in a vineyard, but that he was also had a foot in the new silent scholarly bookish reading, as Illich calls it. So he sees him as standing on that cusp and having a unique philosophy of technology, which Illich considers a model for our time, because Hugh was the first, along with one other anonymous monk called Theophilus Presbyter, to write of tools in the modern sense, to write of the mechanical arts in the modern sense. But he sees still that each art can be plumbed for its wisdom. And so he has, according to Illich, a standard, a theory of enoughness. Now, Illich claimed in his writings on our modern situation that what was necessary in our time was to write a constitution of limits. That's my phrase, not his, but he speaks of a roof of technological characteristics under which a society can live and be happy. So we have to be able to specify what is enough. Otherwise, we will endlessly grow and develop, and ever newer technologies and ever more refined manipulations of our own natures and external natures will present themselves. And where will it end? Where can it end? So how to find this virtue of enoughness? He claimed that Hugh had the and this is in a wonderful essay, which again I unreservedly recommend. It's called Research by People. It's in Shadow Work, a volume maybe not read as frequently as it might be. And in this essay, Research by People, he commends Hugh's standard, let's say, his criterion for evaluating technology, as we now call it, and opposes it to a kind of Baconian science in which the attempt to dominate is potentially unlimited, it's potentially endless. So yes, but he spoke of Hugh as a friend, and in that sense gave a model or an example. An example is better than model. An example of a friendship with people in the past as something that's open to us. And also a way of thinking about the past as a place from which new presence might unfold or erupt, which is a different way, I think, of thinking about the past and about the present and about the future. So
I was wondering, you said something about the Development Crusade, and we're talking about technology, and he died shortly before the social media era really took off. And there's a running argument, which I've been on both sides of this, about how we can talk about place and friendship in a medium which is so rootless and placeless and can be dehumanizing. The internet's a great way for us, some of us, to come in and reach back into the past, but it's also fragmenting our memory and keeping people who maybe would have had an awareness of yesterday stuck in a loop of news and feedback noise. When Donald and I were talking about today's conversation, we said we wanted to sort of steer away from current events because that's sort of the lens that everyone's looking at things through. That seems to be what the digital creates, is this endless now where time and the past disappear, and it's just this moment of anger or fear. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how he saw the digital realm, particularly because while it's all true, this is also how we're speaking today, and it's how Doomer optimists have found one another and how we've found Ivan Illich, and it's a realm of contradictions.
it's absolutely a realm of contradictions. And he was not a systematic thinker, to the extent that system is the premature resolution of contradiction, which I guess might be one way to define it. He didn't go that way. He did, I think, beginning, let's say, just to put a date on it, around 1980, begin to realize the depth, the extent of the change his world was undergoing as it crossed a watershed, a threshold, one he said he had not expected to see in his lifetime, into a new age, which he called the age of systems. And he reevaluated in that light his whole earlier work as being an attempt to address a public of tool users, let's say, who confronted a school, a hospital, whatever, as a tool, as an instrumental means, something from which they stood apart and could potentially change the way they were using it. Right? They could de-school, rein in medicine at a certain threshold. So when he began to take the measure of the age of systems, he thought, well, he took counsel with a lot of others about this who explained it to him, but that the essential attribute of a system is that you are you're part of the system, right? Now that actually goes way beyond technology into the whole revolution in philosophy, let's say, broadly speaking, in our time. So it's a big subject, but that you, as a user of the system, become part of the system. You are no longer outside it. This is an immense challenge because it creates a life of pure immanence, right? There is, if transcendence is outsideness, then there is no transcendence in this world. There's just endless feedback. It's just, so obviously he wanted to explore some of the crazy potentials of such an age and to say what he could about them. No, part two. When I approached him at a meeting in Toronto in 1987 to ask if I could do radio interviews with him, he said, "I don't do that kind of thing anymore. I'm done with that." And a day or so later, when this conference we had been at together was over, I was covering it for the CBC, so I was interviewing people. He took a look at me as we were standing outside. My wife and my young children had come to meet me, and something changed in his view of me at that moment. And he said, "You know, that idea you had, why don't you write to my colleague Wolfgang Sachs about that? We'll see." And then he invited me to State College and put himself at my disposal. He was, as he said, obedient. A strange, interesting, refractory obedience, but obedience it was nonetheless. And why did he do that? Well, he didn't do it because he changed his attitude towards radio. It changed his attitude towards me. So at the beginning of this pandemic, I wouldn't have done this. I said, "No, I'm not doing that. I don't like, I won't do it." Right? I published the book. And I thought, you're wrong. You're shooting you've got to do it. This is how you're going to talk to people. You can't just say, "I don't do that," right? So here we are. And I wouldn't be anywhere else for the world right now than talking to you. So, and Donald. So it's been surprisingly rich, surprisingly good. But still I draw my limits in other places, right? Still I try to keep my footing. Still there could be too much of this. There could very easily be too much of this. So to get out of balance between your enfleshed face-to-face life and your online life, I think would be quite, for me anyway, quite a danger to my stability, to my sense of who and what I am. So, I mean, I could go on. Another thing that happened, it's the same thing you're talking about. Back after I left the CBC, my wife and I were listening to an old program of mine that was about Karl Polanyi, the economic historian, much beloved of Illich. And it included some remarkable interviews, including one with Polanyi's daughter, Carrie Levitt, who's Canadian. And it was really pretty interesting. And Una said, "Well, this really should be available to people." And I mean, one had barely heard of podcasting at that point, but I knew enough to know that I could, in fact, post these things. So I created a website, and I've gradually posted most of what I did at CBC Radio. And it's a little backwater. People write to me and say they can optimize my Google ranking, and I don't answer those letters. I don't want to have my Google ranking optimized. I'm very happy to be a backwater. The correspondence it generates, I can barely keep up with, but so far I can. So that has to be part of my view of the internet, right? As well as the internet as manifest destroyer, amplifier and accelerator of all kinds of craziness. So I think we're stuck with it. We can't uninvent it. So we have to find limits and conviviality within it. And I dare say he would have done no less himself had he been born 100 years later than he was.
A friend visited me on Sunday who's a reader of Illich, and I asked him what he wanted me to ask you. And he talked about how he finds reading Illich paralyzing because the sort of thinking because he agrees with Illich more or less, but that the thinking is so out of step with contemporary thinking that he finds that if he gets too far into it, he's worried about becoming a kind of alien, that he'll be so out of sorts, and so he hesitates at the edge of diving in all the way. And I feel some of that too. And I'm curious about your response to that. And part of what is not paralyzing, I guess I say for me anyway, is that what he actually proposes is very simple, though not easy. It's things like having a threshold that you invite people over. It's encountering a stranger, developing friendship. What he proposes to do is actually very simple, but not easy. And yet those simple tasks are connected to a thinking that really is radically at odds with any kind of thinking you encounter. So I'm curious if you have anything to say to someone who feels paralyzed by Illich's writing.
A bunch of things come to mind. He wasn't a fundamentalist. I think that's the first thing I want to say. There's a wonderful essay, which was actually a kind of a sermon given at a church in the Loop in Chicago when he was lecturing at the McCormick Theological Seminary. It's called The Educational Enterprise in the Light of the Gospel.
It's wonderful.
You can find it online. But there, he'd been reading or talking to a book group that had been reading Schindler's List. So, and Schindler was a far from exemplary character who did something extremely exemplary. He speaks in that essay of a high school principal whose action he admired. So I think he thinks anybody can act in any circumstance. He doesn't say, I won't speak about high school principals because they superintend an enterprise I disapprove of, right? It's not that way. And if to be such an uninhibited critic of institutions, I think it just shows what a free mind can do. He's not afraid, but he's not also imagining that a world without institutions, as if such a thing would be possible, or you could have lived, there was going to be a church, and there's going to be a school system, but it could change. But so he wasn't a fundamentalist. What else would I say to your friend Donald? Maybe that he had a sense of humor, as I tried to relate earlier with the idea about that understanding the gospel is like getting a joke. So I think he himself said to his friend John McKnight once that he was a proscriptive rather than a prescriptive thinker.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always liked that because it makes plain that it's a negative critical enterprise. It's to say what is not worthy of us. It doesn't say how. He never told anyone how they should live. As far as he may have counseled friends facing immediate choices, but there's no master plan. There's no sense of a political philosophy that specifies how something's going to be done in the future. So,
like that closing paragraph of Gender, in which he says, I'm not proposing a strategy here. You have to be open to new possibilities and open to surprises.
yes. Yeah.
Giorgio Agamben, writing about Illich, says that his time of legibility has finally come. And I wonder if you think that's true, and if so, why? Why is Illich suddenly becoming legible to us?
Well, I think it's true and not true, as I'm sure Giorgio himself would allow if you could talk to him about it, because he's been through quite an interesting time during the pandemic himself. So I would say that the way in which the pandemic has been taken, the way in which it's been constructed, if I can say that, and it exactly illustrates that the world that Ivan feared and predicted is here. So it's a world that operates almost entirely under the aegis of risk, that aspires to an astonishing level of social control, and that is utterly preoccupied with life and health to the exclusion almost of anything else, and that is prepared to sacrifice people to those new gods, because I think a case can be made, I would want to try and make it, that the harm that's been done very far outweighs the benefit that might be demonstrated. So in one way, we've moved into the very dystopia he foresaw, but that's also the reason why his ideas become legible, in the sense that it's everything that may not have been evident is now more plainly manifested, right? So to take a concrete statement in The Rivers North of the Future, right, that risk is the most important religiously celebrated ideology in our time, may have raised a few eyebrows in 1998 when he uttered the words. What? But I don't know if it would raise many eyebrows now. I mean, risk is so much taken for granted. It's so much a certainty that it is really what should govern our lives. It's not really questioned, and in many quarters, it's barely questionable. I mean, like, as your friend fears, I guess, to be ostracized. You might be ostracized for questioning it. It's because you're plainly expressing contempt for those at risk. You don't care for them. You must not care for them, or you wouldn't speak that way. So if you love your neighbor, you're going to wear a mask, right? You can read that in the newspaper every day. And if you don't wear a mask, then you don't love your neighbor, and you'll have to put up with being seen as someone who doesn't love their neighbor if you go about unmasked. And so that's the reality.
It's funny that you mentioned that specific example for me today. I think one of the last questions I'd like to ask you, and it's related to exactly this: if friendship and conviviality are so close to his central thesis of non-imposing a system, of this open ability for communion with your neighbor, how did he go about creating these friendships in his own life? And how do we, in this sort of intensely polarized time where if you're trying to practice loving your neighbor, one person, and you don't wear a mask, one person might be mad at you, another person might be glad, where every action is politicized so rapidly, how do we keep friendship open through those constraints?
Well, there's a passage in The River Snows of the Future where he says that the incarnation is a surprise, remains a surprise, and cannot exist as anything else. Is a surprise, remains a surprise, and cannot exist as anything else. Now that's, I would say, pretty radical. Arguably, it doesn't suggest that God has a plan, for example, which many Christians at many times have believed. And it also seems to say that if Mary had said no to whoever it was that came to her door and said Ave, that would have been it. At least for that attempt. There might have been another one somewhere else. Maybe Jesus would have been Ojibwe or Chinese if that hadn't happened. So it's a radical way of looking at things. But it's, not to put it on too high a plane, it's just exactly what happened outside Emmanuel College in Toronto, as I related earlier, when he glanced over and saw me differently. Felt that there was something between us, something that proved immensely influential for both of us. Because in my small way, I've had some influence on his reception, on what he did has existed in the world, and God knows he's changed my life. But that happened on the spur of the moment. It happened on a dime. It happened on a razor's edge. It happened. And so now the other thing that I'd like to say is that he was a very serious man, and perhaps took himself quite seriously as a younger man, and certainly he was one of the great men of his time. I think as he aged, he became more and more willing to see himself as a fool and to see his Lord as a fool, and to name the Lord as a fool. This fool who was crucified, he says, in the rivers north of the future. So, foolishness is foolishness, right? If you take it seriously and not just as a kind of inverted or kind of reverse snobbery or inverted dignity, that you prove that you're smarter by saying you're a fool. Mm-hmm. You don't really mean you're a fool. But to really accept that you're a fool is to accept a radically different form of action in the world than most of my contemporaries would like to believe in, that we can really take it in hand. And so I'm just wandering here, Tara, kind of wildly. But,
wonderful, please do.
But so, yeah, I think it, I mean, if I could say one more thing, it seems to me that it's inherent in that form of understanding to take one step at a time. And that after that one step, the world will have recomposed itself, right? The second step has to be based on the recomposition that occurred after the first step. It isn't that I foresee 10 steps or maybe 20 steps, or I've got a plan for everybody forever. It's a different way of walking, a different way of thinking. It's not unique to Illich. Hannah Arendt says that thinking must always begin again. She uses the image of Penelope's loom, right? That what she wove that day, she unweaves in the evening and then weaves again tomorrow. And that thinking has to begin again, because the process of idolization is instantaneous. To reify is just to make a thing of something, and once you've made something, it is a thing. So the constant remaking, which we called awareness earlier, right? The willingness to live at the edge of time, to be on the razor's edge, is a way of living, a way of thinking, and arguably it is what is set out in the New Testament, since a great deal of what is set out in the New Testament, as far as I can see, is plainly quite impossible to bring into being. And if one did bring it into being, imagine a let the dead bury their dead law. You're going to outlaw funerals? It has to be understood, right? It has to be understood. It has to be, So I'll stop there.
David, there are probably 100 other questions I would love to ask, but I want to respect the limit of our conversation and ask just one more, which is that you in the book alluded in the beginning to a kind of supernatural element to Illich, kind of clairvoyance, maybe. And I wonder if you could talk about that and about the idea of friendship with him since his death, whether it makes sense to think of him as a saint to whom we can ask for intercession, or with whom we can commune for those of us who never met him in his life, through his work and to develop a friendship with him since his death, in the same way he had friendships with those of the past.
Well, I'm a little out of my depth here, but because I trust you both, I'm going to tell a story. First of all, he was clairvoyant, and I don't really want to talk about that much, and he never talked about it much. But the relevant part of it for me is that I trusted him, and I don't see how one can get along without finally having bridges of that kind. That there are moments at which I take the word of another and cross that bridge. And then on the other side of the bridge, I find out, was I right? Was I wrong? But there's no other way to get across than on the word of another at certain moments. I mean, that's the nature of a teacher. A lot of what is called teaching is travesty, but it is a real thing. So I trusted him. But as far as his presence is concerned, it happened about at the end of 2020 that I began to have some heart troubles. And I didn't know what they were, but anyway, after an angiogram, it was discovered that there were blockages in several of my heart arteries, and they said they wanted to keep me in the hospital, and they were going to perform open heart surgery later in that week, a quintuple bypass operation. Various dire things were said. One of the nurses, when she saw the angiogram, said, "Oh yeah, we call that a widowmaker." The nurse treated me as if I was extremely fragile. So this was during COVID. So the hospital was virtually a fortress. But my wife, Yuta, cycled down to see me. And on the way, she experienced the presence of Ivan, as if he were, she said, riding with her. She came into the room. She did not in any way try to tell me what I ought to do or even give a view. And that was probably as dark an afternoon as I've had in my life. I did not want to be there, but I had been overwhelmed. And in her presence, I began to come back into myself. It happened over maybe an hour. And then I thought, okay, I'm leaving now. I'm ready. It wasn't a popular decision with the nurse or the intern or the resident who was on duty, but they weren't able to hold me there. And so since then, I've been fairly well, and I'm not going to give you all my medical history, but I'm happy with that decision. I am quizzical, let's say, about the heart. I know that the surgeon who wanted to open me up and resew my blood vessels thinks he knows the heart. And I know that there's another heart which resonates through song, story, religion, and that those two hearts live in different universes in our time. And I would like to try and hold them together as best I can and see what I can understand as I go along. So he's there. He's there. What happened to Yuta on the way to the hospital that day? We're satisfied that it was our friend who helped us. But how that occurs is something I wouldn't even attempt to specify. So, and I think that's consistent with him also, that he understood that there are limits to what we can say, and that's fairly crucial, I think. That there's a journey that we can only undertake in silence. That there is a beyond words. Words, and that words suffer when they're stretched and distended beyond their capacity to speak. And I normally would not tell that story to two almost strangers, but I trust you both, so I've told it.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. I think that I don't think we can add anything.
No, I don't think
that, and thank you so much for the gift that this book is, and for the gift that the two books of conversations with Illich are. I think
Donald, can you hold up your book again for people?
Oh yes, yes. And it's a beautifully made book, and it's a very large book in every respect. The dimensions of it are remarkable. And you understated, I think, earlier how important you have been in sharing Illich with others. That I'm not sure how read his writings would be much at all today if it weren't for everything you've done. So thank you so much for that gift that you've given all of us.
Well, it's just passing it along, isn't it? So, well, bless you both, and thank you. I've really, really enjoyed this.
Thank you so much for taking your time. I'm just so happy you were here with us.
Well, I hope I meet you one day.